So this last presentation by Paul made a huge impression on me, and it just shows, I guess, to some of the central points that we've heard today about dealing with uncertainty and predictability. I used to deal a lot with anxiety in public spaces, so I'm quite moved by it now, so please bear with me for that tale, but that was really inspiring, so thank you, Paul. What I'm about to talk about is, I guess, the systemic implications of some of the questions launched here today. I've been very humbled and inspired by so many great examples of what it can look like to activate the public in engaging in creative ways. And in length of this, there's been plenty of talk about planning as well, or perhaps a different perception of what planning can be. I think it was Carol yesterday that talked about prototyping as the new planning. There was some previous talk today as well on the sort of fetishism in bureaucracy with roadmaps. And it made me think of a text by Latour that talk about the sort of confusion we often see between the map and the territory. I guess what traditional bureaucrats would always say is that give me the map and I will reshape the territory. And obviously that's a paradox in terms. So I'll try to sort of unpack some of those things a little bit from the practice of Mindlab and some of the projects that we're doing. And I'll also explore, the core functions of government. What does it mean to function as a bureaucracy when you're actually, your core, assignment is to create change? So what does it mean for public policy? What does it mean for development practices? What does it mean for the governance models that we rely on? And what are the current opportunities that we have? And what actually needs to change in that respect? So these are some of the reflections coming out of our work, some of my research as well, and it's certainly not a finished narrative yet, but it is sort of a story that starts to take shape, I think. But for me, so just to sort of rewind back a little bit, these are some of the questions that never get posed in the Danish government. What does it actually mean to pursue the common good? We often ask our collaborative partners in the ministries that own us, who are the primary stakeholder that you have? And their instinct reaction is either to say the minister or the permanent secretary. And we often ask them, well, so the citizens, when do they come into the picture? And they say, oh yes, that's true. We should be thinking about that as well. And obviously there's a logic there about serving the political and then counting on that to be serving the public. But I do think there is perhaps new things to be thought of in terms of building or rebuilding or remaking the sort of coalition between the public services, whether it's the relationship between civil services and citizens, or whether it's the relationship between civil servants and the politicians themselves. So how do we create these circumstances and conditions for people to flourish in society and organizations to work with government? And how do we fight this tendency that often it seems to happen that in communities have to develop in spite of and not because of government? And from that, rethinking our institutions. So this is the logic. I think this is one of our permanent secretaries sort of admitting that there might be a problem in some of the mentalities that are going on. There is this inside-out thinking, there's this top-down, we-know-it-all attitude, and that is certainly not fitted to our time and probably never has. But now there is, fortunately, increasing recognition, at least in Denmark, among ministers, among permanent secretaries, that there's a call for an outside-in perspective, enabling more bottom-up change to happen. So especially in light of this, and in light of that you could sort of identify a few burning platforms for a cultural change in government, there is a momentum going. One of the problems that we often see is also something that participal design unit in the UK has called the Gyroscope problem, which is basically a lot of government services are built around delivering services around citizens, to citizens, within their system silo, within their system logic, not necessarily, possibly never coordinated with the other services within their own lawmaking scheme, which means they might be able to react to the citizens' situation. They might be able to support them in staying where they are, but the ability to actually work with citizens, to actually make them a part of a transformative process is very, very limited. So especially with the more vulnerable people of society, this is a huge problem, and it creates a gap between the capability of public services and the lives of the citizens in that respect. Another development which you can see, obviously is sort of the core of this session, is societal developments around both the blurring of boundaries, but certainly also, and it's been mentioned several times as well yesterday, sharing economies, more community action, local innovations happening, participation schemes that are being developing from the bottom up, more co-production, all of these things that are happening without the government's involvement, so to speak. And the question is, for example, with the sharing economy at the moment, we are working with the Ministry of Business to try to stop them from regulating this area, basically, because this is their natural reaction to this. This is something we can't control, so our role must be to regulate. And we are trying to sort of go in on an explorative journey with them and say, well, let's just wait a while. Let's explore what this can do, and let's explore whether the role of government can be another one in this context. Another thing that I tend to sort of find a lot is that there is a sort of a misconceived productivity interpretation. New public management regimes have certainly taught us what it means to optimize a system. It hasn't taught us anything about what it means to rethink or reshape a system or re-explore what the problem actually consists of. And there's a lot of, I think, in my view at least, wrong problem diagnosing going on. And especially when it comes to problems that fall into the complex area of this model here, the more emergent ones, the ones that don't have a specific diagnosis but you need to rediscover again and again, there's a leeway here to explore that. So what is productive in relation to which problem is also a sort of a burning platform. And then the final thing I just want to mention before I go into talking more about Mindlab is the sort of the political side of this. We have a lot of both colleagues as well as one of the permanent secretaries in our leadership board, who says, well, when he started, he was hired in 3 years ago in the Ministry of Employment. He said, well, to his new co-workers, said, well, let's look at the history here. Let's look at the successful schemes, the successful reforms we've had over the last 20 years. And then the room of his colleagues were pretty passive, not really saying, well, we should look at that or we should look at that, but basically admitting, well, we don't have any success stories because they all sort of failed in an implementation process. There were some things that worked, but a lot of what was politically intended didn't work. And for me, this is a huge democratic problem. And I think across the board in ministries, in Denmark at least, there is a recognition that the ability to implement political intentions, the ability from going from policy to practice, has sort of lived under the radar in terms of accepting that is not possible, rather than say, well, maybe there's a different way of going about this. And for me, this becomes, again, going back to what it means to be a public servant. This is one of the key areas for me. And again, also something that Mindlab is sort of going into working with. So a little bit more about just concretely Mindlab as an institution, and perhaps an example of what it means to institutionalize a cultural change in government. Mindlab is, as I said, co-owned by 3 ministries and a municipality. It's the Ministry of Employment, the Ministry of Education, and the Ministry of Business, as well as the municipality of Odense, which is the third largest municipality in Denmark. And there's a logic there, obviously, about being cross-governmental, collaborating across policy areas, but as well, and this has been the recent sort of addition with the municipality, also working across different levels of government. So basically having a municipality as a place of local experimentation for policies, for ideas, and for creating a better dynamic between the local level, the implementation, and the national strategic level. And within that, Mindlab has been sort of situated with a board of permanent directors, so at the very top level on one hand, and then the point of it is to bring in the concrete insights, the concrete experiences of citizens, of businesses, or NGOs, or whoever the users are, or relevant actors are in the policy area that we're working in. And then using that connection or that knowledge to collaborate with, first and foremost, our sort of colleagues in the ministries, the public managers, the employees there. But then secondly, obviously, involving the stakeholders, involving other public sector organizations according to the problem at hand. And the logic, as I said, is quite simple. It's about, discovering what's really going on, the practice, the experiences, the feelings, not so much maybe what people say, but actually what people do. And then taking that into a process of discovering what that implies. Whether it can be smaller service design ideas or larger policy schemes. It depends on the project. And the skill sets that goes into that, I won't go into detail now, just to say that we think of it as a combination of social research, very much also embedded in what is, the system logics, the public administration. Can't be too naive. We can't go in and say, well, user insights is the most important thing. We need to know about the political agendas. We need to know how to make the point in the existing systems in order to work with them or change them if that's possible. And then we have a design element to it, which is about making reality concrete, making the insights that are coming out of the research illustrative to the people that make decisions. And around that, obviously, there is project management, creative facilitation in that, but also a large element of organizational development, which I'll return to in a second. So we are called the Public Innovation Lab, and there are so many different definitions of that. This is just one of them. I think it's actually the European Commission that's sort of set this definition out. And I think that the central part for me here, obviously there's an active involvement part, there's multiple partners, there's bringing people together part, but there is the dedicated space part. And it's not only a dedicated space for developing ideas, but it's actually to think of a lab in a virtual way. So a way of creating a space, a process, if you will, at the level that is needed. So a process that not only sort of looks at the present in terms of what can be known now, what are people experiencing, and analyzing that, but also going into the future of rehearsing new ways of coming up with both concepts and solutions that it can then be tested in an iterative way. This is the prototyping part, obviously. And the point also being that this space is not a one-off process. It's something that needs to be going round and round several times for things to make sense and to have an impact. And these, as I said, this process, this is just our portfolio. We can think of this space in very different ways. This is usually the combination of elements that we are sort of in one way or another involved in our projects. It will usually also start somewhere. So either it will be a service design project that unfolds into being a policy-oriented project as well. Then we will be forced to work with the governance aspects of the solution, and then becomes the capacity part of it as well. So just to say that this combination is really important. So just to sort of sum up what Mindlab is trying to do is in terms of a cultural change, is basically taking the public sector for this sort of, direct and control model, authorities, creating regulations and services and giving them to citizens, to a more outcomes-focused one, where solutions are created in the space or in the intersections between these different entities. I guess you could say, just to sum it up on that note, that Mindlab not only introduces a broader scope of people, certainly it's about citizens and experiences, but often it's also about frontline workers or other users in the system. It's about bringing in the new knowledge. It's about bringing in the new process. I just mentioned that before. And we will usually come up with new kinds of solution concepts that will have a human-centered element or practice-centered element to it. As I said, very much outcomes-focused in terms of what it takes to uphold the kind of solution that we come up with. So just one example on top of that. We've been working with the Ministry of Employment for a while, and going from sort of one-off projects to actually a more longer-term partnership recently around this agenda of creating a new culture of public policy making. It all started with a project that was focusing on this phase of the policy cycle. So there is this very, very ambitious reform agenda in Denmark at the moment. They're reforming early pensioning, they're reforming flex jobs, they're reforming social benefits, they're reforming sickness benefits, all of which are targeting the most vulnerable people of society. So these are the people that have been in the system for a long time without any significant change in their life situation. As I mentioned before, the Gyroscope problem there. And the reforms all set out to change the delivery logics in the frontline service as well as in the policy area of it. So what we did was basically, as I illustrated before as well, go out in a qualitative way, in an in-depth perspective on the implementation phase at an early stage. So it was not to check whether reform was working or not. It was not an evaluation. It was more to look at practice, what was really going on, what are the real experiences of frontline workers, of citizens, with, when the ministry is actually coming with this policy intent, with these intentions of creating a different employment system. One of the citizens that I've encountered was Sarah here. She's been on social benefits since she was 18. Now she's 24. She's been having sort of suffered through extensive drug abuse, domestic violence, bad family relations because of these things. She also had trouble with anxiety. She tried, suicide at one time. All kinds of really bad, life situations. And she had the traits of many of the citizens that we encountered in this field work. She was lacking hope, she was lacking self-confidence, she was lacking motivation to do anything. And she had a fundamental distrust in the system's ability and even intent to help her or support her in her situation. And there's an important point here. There's been a lot of talk about ideas in this conference. I certainly agree with all of it. But there's a component here which also is about the people that might not have ideas, might not even have a language of knowing what they want. And in this case, we've tried to follow some of these citizens over a longer period of time. We also followed the people that were involved in their situation and trying to capture and taking seriously their experience through observation, through hanging out, through involving and making things with them. So just to say that the knowledge we're looking for is not only ideas that people can voice, but actually also the unvoiceable knowledge, and especially when it comes to the more vulnerable people. So in terms of going on from that kind of knowledge, when we looked at the service journeys, and we looked at all the defeats that they were experiencing in the system, there was all sort of activations by the system on their terms rather than the citizens. What would be then what would be the factors that could create good outcomes from this premise? And what we were looking at in terms of implications was a paradigm shift in employment services that was basically centered around some of these concepts here. It was citizen-centered, more involvement than diagnosing the situation for the citizen. It was more focused on rehabilitation, investing in the situation rather than delivering services. It was focused on building the citizens' resources and not focusing only on the problems or what the citizen wasn't able to do. It was more relational. It was more sort of building up contextual knowledge in the situation and coordinating and working from that premise. It was focused on much on employability, as some people call it, which is focusing on the more non-direct factors of employment, which, for example, can be about building someone's self-confidence, for example. And it was very much cross-professional collaborations and bringing in disciplines and other sectors as part of the solution. And just to say that is obviously a paradigm shift that is a huge implementation challenge for the ministry. So the normal way of going about implementation in the ministry, thinking that we formulate the policy and then the policy becomes the problem of local municipalities, the sort of us and them relationship, was certainly not going to work in this case. I don't think it ever works, but this was a particularly illustrative example of it. We tried to sort of both give the implementation insight and support in order to sort of visualize those unintended outcomes and the implementation challenge from the local people's perspective. But also through that, trying to create a real collaboration around implementation rather than the sort of debate that usually is going on there. And then now we're working with the ministry to see, well, how can we then invest in the implementation process, both in sort of prototyping the front-end service deliveries, but also in the back-end governance models interactions that needs to happen there. What I just particularly want to focus on is the last point here in terms of building a more, perhaps what I've called humble approach to public policy. This is also just a way of going away from the sort of normal problems that policy might be characterized by, in particularly in working with what kind of wider network of support and validation that you can build around a policy implementation process. So what we've done with the ministry, not only we started by looking at qualitatively at the early stage of the implementation process, but we say, well, why don't we take this is their view of their policy process, why don't we take the policy process and go through the phases and see what we can do to increase the likelihood of success at other stages. So in other words, creating a human-centered design-led policy process. And what we've what we're still doing is going through that and testing different methodologies, different tools, different approaches, different processes. One of them is policy workshops involving citizens in the idea phase of new reforms. When actually identifying the challenge, coming in with that view is obviously very, very important. We also try to look at risk scenarios, or perhaps challenging the current perception of what risk is in the public sector. It's not only about managing risk. It is about managing risk and not avoiding risk. We are sort of supporting some voluntary practice testing. So when they sort of see new ideas, either coming from the political level or through their own knowledge, going into sort of voluntary partnerships with municipalities or NGOs to test those ideas out, bring them back and see what we can learn from that is also something that we are looking at. What we've done recently as well is, and this has also already been sort of institutionalized, is do mandatory internships. So basically this is about civil servants spending time with caseworkers and citizens over a larger period of time to get that fundamental knowledge about what practice smells like, looks like, feels like. So when they sit and formulate the policy at a later stage, they will have that as the core of their sort of knowledge capacity. So it's not only about economic considerations or legal aspects, but it's actually about thinking about the citizen in practice when they do it. And then finally, what we're also looking at is the concept of implementation teams, which is still sort of a vague one, but thinking about, while the political agreements are being made, but also beyond that, how can you support in a dynamic way things on the ground? So all of that just to say that, and going back to the culture aspect of all this, our public institutions are not those primordial entities with self-evident rationalities, even though I think a large of people I know, is sort of, especially my colleagues in the ministries, act as if it is. Like they say always, when I say, well, can we rethink this? Can we think about a different kind of dialogue, for example, with the politicians in this and this way? And they say, well, it's always like this, and it's almost like a holy land you can't touch. But I would say, and this is also proof of this, that public sector practices are cultural interpretations, and what we're trying to do is to work through the people of the organizations to create a new culture. So just to finish off, 5 aspects of this cultural change. One is obviously rethinking the culture of decision making. I mentioned outcomes as opposed to outputs as an important part. Plenty of people have talked about experimentation today. One thing I do want to sort of mention here is that it is about a new authority role. So it is about taking ownership for learning-based explorative processes where you don't know in advance. And this is something that is really, really difficult for the public sector. Somehow there's been this embedding of a know-it-all culture that needs to be changed. So you can still be a public authority and sometimes be insecure about what is right or wrong, and you need to test that out instead of pretending that you know it in advance. And I think then also about knowledge, the kind of knowledge you bring into the decision-making process. What is the legitimate knowledge is right now? And how can you, with that knowledge, collaborate and co-produce policy or other development initiatives from that? And now I've talked about knowledge. I think that is crucial, especially in these sort of fetishized data times where we talk about big data, small data. Data actually means what is given. What is given can be many different things. It can be qualitative, statistical, calculative. It can also be figurative. It can also be generative. There are many different ways of knowing about the world. And I think at this stage, bureaucracy is very, very unnuanced about the use of knowledge. So I think this is a critical aspect of changing the culture of decision making and the culture of government. And then the third one, attitude. Sort of very much in length of that. This is about how, I guess, we understand the world to some extent. I'm not saying that we should disband what's on the left side here, the analysis, the splitting part of it. We have to be rational, logical, and all that. We have to try to think through. But there's a combination here to be made about thinking things through and doing rapid prototyping, for example. It's about sort of judging when to be what, and then combining the intuitive with the logical, and combining the emotional with the rational. We all often talk about in Mindlab is something called professional empathy, which is basically a way of trying to create empathy among decision makers, not to sort of disband their professional knowledge or their expertise, but to say, well, we need to combine that with a relation to the problem, to the relation to the public that is different, that first of all motivates your actions, but also second of all makes you engage with the problem in a different way. And a fourth thing, sort of very much in length of that, and something that I'm still to this date very curious about, is that how do we get public professionals to identify as change agents? Because I found it as a great paradox that the ones that are responsible for the most large-scale change processes, change-making processes in our societies, politicians or civil servants as myself, they don't identify as such. They identify either as analysts or as law experts or whatever. But they're all part of a larger scheme, which is about creating real change for real people. And I think just that sort of identification can really make a difference when we go forward and think about the future of government and the future of the civil service in that respect. But I also recognize that there is a fifth component to that, which is about the existential questions of this equation. So we need to be respectful of when we talk about people being courage or having to have courage, or we talk about what was the word that was mentioned earlier, guerrilla bureaucrats, that we should certainly push for having more of those, but in that process we have to think about what are their deepest fears, when do they actually feel that they have a sense of agency, and then perhaps working from those questions, what are their personal barriers to risk-taking, what are the, and especially, and this was mentioned yesterday as well, can we somehow create a community of peers where public innovators don't feel so alone as they do right now. So the lone bureaucrat that tries to change something, but actually perhaps think about it in terms of movements. So all of these aspects, I think, when thought together, might lead to creating better outcomes and increasing the legitimacy of public interventions and our democratic systems, perhaps. And then also perhaps abolish any sort of perceived distinction between what is now thought of as a bureaucrat and what we can think of as a creative public servant. Thank you.